In a recent vlog, I said this. I grew up around a radial arm saw. We didn't even have a table saw. To rip a sheet of plywood, you stood it on its edge on the floor, and then you turned the blade towards you, right about at gut level, and then you pushed the plywood sheet past the blade along the floor as it cut. If you still had your arms and you weren't disemboweled when you were done, it was a good day. I got some pushback on that because some folks just couldn't believe that was a common practice that was actually encouraged by DeWalt, the maker of the first radial arm saws. Well, here's the proof. This is a 1954 catalog similar to the one that came with my grandfather's DeWalt PowerShop radial arm saw, the saw I grew up around. And here's one of the methods they suggest for breaking down a sheet of plywood and possibly opening your stomach in the process. Granted, in that video I said rip when I meant crosscut, but this was a real thing back then. And it wasn't the only crazy thing people did with these saws. In a minute, we're going to take a trip down memory lane through the pages of some of the old brochures from the 50s and 60s and see some of the nuttiest practices. And to help us decide whether radial arm saws are useful tools or just oversized cast iron paperweights that were dreamed up by some clever Madison Avenue marketing executive. But we can't have even a short discussion about radial arm saws without addressing the giant elephant in the room. Are they safer or more dangerous than table saws? So let's spend just a couple minutes on that question and then we'll get to the fun. I saw a video the other day, if you like radial arm saws and you've searched on YouTube, you've probably seen it too, by an older gentleman who has 40 years of woodworking experience having never owned a table saw, just radial arm saws. Now there is no way you're going to walk into his shop and tell him a radial arm saw is overly dangerous. He knows how to use one safely, and he has all 10 of his fingers for 40 years to prove it. But he said something that surprised me, that radial arm saws are safer than table saws because they do not kick back. At first I thought, they don't kick back? That's a stunning statement. But as I watched, I realized he came to that conclusion because he changed the terminology. When a piece of wood binds between the fence and the blade, he calls that ejection instead of kickback. So he's essentially saying radial arm saws don't kick back, they eject wood. Whatever, the blade kicked the board backwards when it pinched against the side, the spinning plate. So I call it kickback, but you can call it whatever you want. His real point though, and it was an interesting one, was that a radial arm saw will not cause the type of kickback that leads to a lot of table saw amputations. We discussed this kind of kickback in our table saw kickback video, which if you value your fingers, you should definitely watch. I'll link to it in the description below this video. That type of kickback occurs when the blade lifts the board on top of itself and then throws it away from you, pulling your hand into the blade in the process. Because the blade of a radial arm saw is above the cutting surface instead of below it like on a table saw, the teeth push the workpiece downward instead of pulling it upward, and that type of dangerous kickback that claims so many fingers on a table saw doesn't occur on a radial arm saw. Of course, it doesn't occur on a table saw either if you use a blade guard and at least a riving knife. But it seemed to be the basis that he and some others used to say that radial arm saws are safer than table saws. And maybe you could persuade me if it weren't for the fact that radial arm saws introduce entirely new dangers by their very design. For example, a table saw blade won't climb up on top of the workpiece and lurch towards you, but a radial arm saw blade can climb on top of a board and go towards your body. Now, I hear folks saying that's not dangerous because your hands should never be in front of the blade anyway, so if the blade climbs and lurches towards you, you won't be cut. That's correct in a perfect world. But I live in reality. And the reality of it is an unexpected violent climb with a radial arm saw is very startling. The first time it happens, you may even have to empty your shorts. And what happens sometimes when we're startled? Your hands can do unexpected things through involuntary muscle movement, even potentially go into a blade. That's why you never walk up behind someone using a power tool of any kind. If you startle them, you can injure them. Radial arm saws have that feature built right in. Incidentally, sliding compound miter saws can also climb onto a workpiece in the same way, perhaps even easier than a radial arm saw. And handheld circular saws can kick back, pull out of the cut in almost any direction. Which brings me to the obvious conclusion that all power tools, especially saws, have their own sets of dangers. I don't consider a radial arm saw inherently dangerous any more than I would a table saw or any other type of circular saw. But you'd better know what you're doing before you use one. and you should never demand more from the machine than it was intended to do. And that is where radial arm saws get themselves in trouble. For decades, they were marketed as all-in-one machines that could cross-cut, rip, bevel, dado, sand, grind, plane, turn, make cappuccino, route moldings, raise panels, slice lunch meat, plane boards, you name it. This is a 1948 DeWalt radial arm saw instruction book. This is from around the time when these saws were first offered to consumers so folks could come home from their stressful office jobs to their sheds and basements in the suburbs and unwind with a little woodworking in their shirt and tie while the little lady fixed them a martini. These images aren't great, but even in the beginning you can see all the things they claimed you could do with these saws. You see that one right there? Look at how much of the blade is exposed by the very nature of a blade being entirely above the table, as it is on all radial arm saws, and only half of it at best covered with a guard. If that board has a crack in it that you didn't see, or it kicks back and ejects across the shop, which can happen, where is Ward Cleaver's hand going to end up? How about now? This guy's serious. Can you think of a worse way to cut a rabbit? How about if we throw a much more aggressive blade, like a shaper, on there? They call this tenon cut seemingly difficult at first. If all that exposed blade doesn't tighten your pucker, you and the Brady Bunch can make some great furniture together. And it got worse as time went on and the brain boxes in marketing kept overruling the engineers. Here's one, the 2-point shaper cutter. It's basically a lawnmower blade for your saw. You want to experience some real kickback or climb? Put on something that can take enormous bites out of wood at 3,500 RPM. Here, Father Knows Best is raising a panel with no blade guard and with the workpiece trapped between the blade and the table. If something causes that panel to lift and put pressure against the flat part of that spinning saw plate, it could be goodbye panel and hello hooks for hands. A sanding disc doesn't have teeth, but that doesn't mean the edge won't cut you. And if you've ever used a high-speed orbital sander, you know what can happen if that disc isn't perfectly flat on the wood. Is your grip of that board stronger than half a horsepower? What could go wrong here? Check out Mr. Loose Sleeves. Where's your push stick, buddy? Interestingly, while they continued to put out these brochures showing all sorts of unsafe practices and a conspicuous absence of safety equipment, the lawyers must have been getting nervous because they began hastily throwing together separate safety tip sheets, obviously pecked out in some broom closet on an old Remington typewriter and then secretly slipped into the boxes because they directly contradicted things seen in the official brochures. Now let's get back to that plywood question. When the radial arm saw started taking off, so was plywood for the consumer market. And working with those big sheets could have thrown a wrench into DeWalt's plans to replace the table saw completely. So they had to MacGyver a solution. Here they show it looks like a rip right down the middle of a 4x8 sheet in the same manner you would do it on a table saw. But to do this, you have to rotate the blade carriage so that it's spinning in the opposite direction from what it would be under normal ripping conditions. Then you rip from the opposite side, from left to right, while remembering that all other rips have to be done from right to left. Keep those feed directions straight, or your saw will self-feed both the wood and potentially your hands right into the blade. That's okay for rips, but do you remember how to cross-cut a sheet of plywood? On the end, of course. Just turn the blade so it's cutting completely unprotected at gut level, and then slide that sheet right on past. But don't do this if you've had too much dinner. You might end up with the first half of a tummy tuck. Now some of you are watching this and saying I'm being too dramatic. All these worries are based on worst case scenarios, and you're absolutely correct. But it's within those worst case scenarios that life-changing injuries occur. I know this personally. If you doubt me, go to any emergency room and ask about the woodworking injuries they see every day. Almost all of them involve experienced woodworkers who knew what they were doing. You know darn well a router table or a shaper with proper safety devices is a safer way to raise a panel. But that radial arm saw is just sitting there, and the brochure makes it look so easy. My one-arm buddy Cletus has made lots of raised panels on his, and he says it's not too bad if you're careful. I bet my chances of getting hurt are 1 in a million. I like those odds. But that's not how it works. You have to divide that 1 in a million by the 4 sides of your raised panel. Then you have to divide it by the number of doors in your kitchen cabinets. Then divide it by the number of times you're going to repeat that task in your lifetime. Those 1 in a million odds just became about 1 in 1,000. That's better than your chances of winning $25 on a scratch-off ticket at the Piggly Wiggly. Again, we're talking about getting hurt using a radial arm saw for something it shouldn't be used for, like raising panels or cutting yourself in half. If you're using it properly for crosscuts, well, then your odds of getting hurt are really no higher than cross-cutting with a compound miter saw. It's all about how you use or misuse the tool. Come on though, would big companies like DeWalt or Craftsman risk suggesting something they knew was unsafe? Yes, because they wanted to sell saws. They weren't afraid to lie to you. They put the biggest lies right on the front of the brochures. Look at this 1949 ad saying it will cut accurately at any angle. Anyone who has used a radial arm saw for long knows this is not true. They cut accurately if you keep them well tuned and the arm locked at 90 degrees. I know folks who have actually tack welded there so that arm stays at 90 degrees. You start pivoting and rotating and doing all this nonsense with a radial arm saw, and you'll be spending half your day realigning it just to make straight cuts again. That's because the saw itself simply wasn't made for all this nonsense. DeWalt developed the radial arm saw in the 20s for cross-cutting large timbers that were too long for a table saw. Big versions with 16-inch blades were used in mills and factories. They were rough cross-cutting tools. But those guys were definitely shrewd businessmen. They sold millions of radial arm saws to folks who believed the photos in the brochures and thought they were buying a miracle tool when they were just buying a Swiss Army knife that did a lot of things, but only one of them well: cross-cutting. That's why when compound miter saws hit the market, radial arm saws hit the curbs. You can get them pretty cheap today without hardly looking. And now that you can hardly go to an estate sale without tripping over one, a lot of new woodworkers ask me, should I get a radial arm saw? And I don't want you to get the wrong impression for this video. I'm mocking the marketing and all the crazy dangerous stuff they said you could do with the saw. I'm not saying the saw itself is useless or inherently dangerous if you use it in the proper way. So my answer is simple. As long as you learn to use it safely and you don't ask more from it than it's really supposed to be used for, which to me means keeping that arm locked at 90 degrees and using simple jigs if you want to cut miters. And for goodness sakes, do not copy that stupid stuff you see in the old catalogs with those weird attachments and even some of the irresponsible videos I see on YouTube. This is not a router, folks. If you do that, then go for it. Grab one of those old radial arm saws off Craigslist or from an estate sale and drag it back to the shop. Cast iron DeWalts are definitely the best. The later Craftsman and Black & Decker models, not so much. DeWalts from the 50s are some of the best looking power tools ever made, in my opinion. That's what I have, and it's stored in my shed because I just don't find it that useful, and space in my old shop is at a premium. But now that I have a bigger shop, I may bring my grandfather's radial arm saw back in and make some videos about it. I'll see you then. If you get what you pay for, then why are bandsaw blades so inexpensive at sawblade.com? Seriously, they're as good as any I've used. They come in any size you need, and they cost quite a bit less than anything comparable at the woodworking retailers. Try them for yourself at the link below this video. You'll see. Wait, don't go yet. If you're new here, please subscribe and remember to ring the bell. I would really appreciate that. Give us a thumbs up, or better yet, leave us a comment. I always read them. And be sure to check out the latest issue of Stumpy Nubs Woodworking Journal. It's always packed with tips, tricks, and tutorials designed to make you a better woodworker.